Good morning, good afternoon, and or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and Director of External Relations for the Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network, FOUN. Today, only a few days after President Zelensky visited Washington, some members of FOUN will discuss the outcome, ramifications of the president's trip to Washington. Those who have followed the foundation and our numerous webinars surely know our today's panelists, but I'll introduce them very briefly. Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. Paula was just also named to the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. Ambassador John Herbst, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe and senior advisor to Human Rights First. Peter Rowe, senior fellow and director, Center for Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. Ambassador Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, distinguished fellow at CEPA. Okay. Now, if you want to ask questions, there's a chat room. I can't guarantee we'll get to them, but I'll try to do so. The title of the webinar, Ukraine Victory, Are Washington Signals Flashing Yellow? Last week, Ukraine and President Zelensky were major news, starting with his presentation at the United Nations and through his trip to Washington. Paula, to begin, let us start with Zelensky at the UN. He gave an impassioned speech. Your thoughts on that, and do you sense he gained any demonstrable additional support from that presentation?
Bob, thank you for the question. But first, let me just say thank you for bringing us all together to have this moment of reflection. It's come at a very crucial time. And then secondly, let me just slightly correct. You introduced me as joining the National Endowment for Democracy Board. I've joined the International Republican Institute Board, but it is part of the NED. But thank you very much. You are correct indeed that Zelensky did give a very impassioned speech, and let me just categorize some of the core themes. First, I think most significantly, his speech was one calling for unity of the global community. And unity towards what? He was talking, secondly, very specifically about Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and that it was incumbent upon everyone, the entire global community, to understand that this fight in Ukraine impacts everyone. That specifically here, if the invasion is not successfully won, if the tide is not stemmed here, against aggression, then in that case, that all will be experiencing aggression. So everyone has a stake in it. But I found it very significant that he spoke to the question of weaponization. He talked first and foremost about food. And here, the countries that he focused on Latin America, Africa, Asia. He also referenced China in that regard. China depends on Ukraine for its grain. So the weaponization of food certainly featured very prominently. Also, the issue of energy and the weaponization of energy, and what this portends not just for the European community, but for all countries concerned. And then he even went into the kind of genocide and used the word genocide being waged against the children of Ukraine. I think I would say that his target was very much on, to use that term, the South or the global South. He was looking at trying to garner support in ways that actually all these countries are being affected. As I said, China relies a very large portion on its grain from Ukraine. So does Egypt, some 75%. So if these issues are not resolved, clearly it's not just a war against Ukraine, but it is a war that Moscow is waging against the global community. I'll finally say this. I think that when you look at it, what's the impact? I think that he had an impact because he was bringing to the foreground issues that really matter to all these other countries, and in which their livelihood, their own communities and populations are being impacted adversely. It was significant to me that he also took the time and the effort to meet, not just give that impassioned speech, but meet on the sidelines those leaders from the South. One of the biggest meetings happened to be with Lula of Brazil, in which they talked about the importance of peace. Zelensky in his remarks talked about his peace plan. He reminded everyone that he also had raised the peace plan when he was in Indonesia. So how it comes out, I do think that it gives many countries a great deal of pause for thought. Those that have been somewhat supportive of Ukraine and against Russia's aggression, but have sat on the fence in terms of not coming out with stronger actions against Russia. A condemnation in the United Nations, where they still get, Ukraine has gotten a lot of support in the General Assembly, but it hasn't been translated per se into sanctions, other ways of taking action against Russia. Forgive me, it was a longer answer, but I thought I would just set the stage in that regard, because I do think that Zelensky really gave an incredible speech that should have a great deal of traction globally.
Well, thank you. No, I think that was an excellent summary. That certainly reflects what I saw going on there. Kurt, Zelensky's Washington visit was much different than his visit just 9 months earlier. You know, in those intervening months, opponents of support for Ukraine seem to have gained traction, and it would appear their numbers are growing. We're approaching an election year where prominent candidates oppose more aid. I think if I were to have written a headline last Friday morning, first thing in the morning, as the president flew off to Canada, it might have read, "Message to Ukraine. Senator McConnell, go. Speaker McCarthy, stop. President Biden, wait." But maybe a number of things happened since Friday to change how that headline and that trip went. Kurt, what's your take on Zelensky's visit?
Well, thanks very much, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And I think Paula did a great job summarizing Zelensky's trip to New York, where the audience was the global South. But in Washington, the audience was the administration and the Congress, and to some degree, the American people, to make the case that Ukraine is fighting for American interests, for both values, freedom and democracy, and also stopping Russian aggression in Ukraine so that we don't have to worry about trying to stop it later somewhere else. Unfortunately, as you point out, the tone was very different here from the White House and from the Congress than the tone was 9 months ago. 9 months ago, he did a joint session of Congress. He had a big press conference with President Biden, and it was it was full of resolution and determination and a lot of references to Churchill. And this time around, the White House did not do a joint press conference. His meetings on the Hill were behind closed doors. It came amid our own budget fight over a continuing resolution or whether there's a government shutdown. And the voices, I wouldn't necessarily say more numerous, but more vocal, more loud voices against continuing aid to Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, I think that paints a rather dismal or grim picture of the way it looked in Washington, when in fact the reality is better. And first off, you have a solid majority of both parties in Congress and in the public who support Ukraine and support continued assistance to Ukraine. And McCarthy clearly has the votes to get aid through to Ukraine when he's prepared to do it. But of course, the timing is not right, dealing with our broader budget issues first. The White House has provided substantial support to Ukraine over the last year and a half. Now, I think all of us in this meeting agree that it has been too slow and too grudging and one step at a time, but they've actually done it. But we haven't seen the president get out and make the case to the public in a forceful way that supporting Ukraine is an American national security interest, and here's why we're doing it, and that we're going to continue to do it. And without that kind of leadership from the White House, you have a little bit lack of leadership or lack of clarity from some of the others. I honestly think that the person who has done the most to make this case is actually the Republican majority leader, Mitch McConnell, who almost every day goes to the floor and says something about Ukraine. But the others are not making the case as much. Now, that all being said, I think there's something that happened in the course of this visit or just before the visit that's very positive. It appears as though the Abrams tanks are arriving, and it appears as though the administration made a decision to provide a type of ATACMS, one that would include cluster bomblets as the payload rather than a single shot ATACMS, which is a very positive thing, something that they had not been willing to do before. So they finally got around to this decision, and they didn't announce it in advance, which is a very good thing as well, because it's important that the Russians actually discover that they have it when they've been hit by it, rather than giving them time to prepare and get away. So I think that is something positive that did happen. And then the final part of this it's part of your question, is how does this play out going forward? You know, we're looking at a presidential election next year. And it's interesting. There's only one candidate who has come out on the Republican side clearly against aid to Ukraine, and that's Vivek Ramaswamy. And he's been, knocked down a few times because of that position. Trump has been vague. He said that this wouldn't have happened if he were president, and that if he were elected, he would end it in one day, but he hasn't said how. And I think he's probably deliberately keeping his powder dry, waiting to see what's going to happen over the next year and a half. But all of the other major Republican candidates are firmly in support of aid to Ukraine and willing to make the case. And it was at the August presidential debate that Nikki Haley really took that on with Ramaswamy, did very well, got a lot of applause for that. So I think that the American public and even the voters, even on the Republican side and the candidates, they are ready to support continued aid to Ukraine. I think they understand the American interests and national security interests at stake. But we need leaders to come out and keep explaining that and talking about it. And I think if we have that in the Republican debates, it's actually going to be positive for the environment in the country. People will be more sympathetic as this gets debated and argued more in the course of the debates.
Well, thank you. You might be a little more positive on that than I am, but
well, I am a little bit. I am a little bit, because I don't see Trump taking it on as a major issue to say, I'm against this. I see him wanting to do more on the domestic issues, the social agenda, the wall, the Justice Department and the FBI, all of his grievances, less on the foreign policy side.
Well, I do. And one thing you said, I want to emphasize that Friends of Ukraine Network, put out recommendations at the early part of every year of what U.S. aid should be. And the Task Force on National Security's number one recommendation was that the president get out and make the case to the American public. And as you point out, that just really hasn't been done yet. Ben, Friends of Ukraine Network, and certainly you personally have argued over and over the U.S. is not giving Ukraine what it needs to win. Now, as Kurt pointed out, some Abrams tanks, we don't know how many, are on the ground now in Ukraine. We don't know how many. And the administration has said that, a version of ATACMS is now going to be given. Are things changing, and are we starting to give Ukraine what it needs to win?
Well, of course, the one thing that Ukraine desperately needs, and we continue to refuse to provide it, is a clear declaration of what our strategic objective is. I mean, this nonsensical, we're with you for as long as it takes, means absolutely nothing. So the president, I wish he would sit there at the presidential desk, look into the camera like Reagan did, and said, my fellow Americans, let me tell you what this is about. Let me tell you why this is important. And I agree with what Kurt said earlier, that I think people, because it's such an obvious good case, that if he would make it, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. And if he said, we want Ukraine to win, it's in our interest that Ukraine wins, ejects Russia back to the 1991 borders, then there's no more excuses about, oh, we don't have enough ATACMS, or Abrams tank burns too much fuel, or it takes too long to train a pilot. I mean, all this BS. Say what the objective is, and then everything else will fall in place, including the Germans, by the way. The Germans will immediately say, okay, good, Americans are doing it, we'll provide Taurus as well. Now, look, our president has done a phenomenal job. More than 50 nations sticking together. The Kremlin in a zillion years would have never guessed that Germany would be the #2 contributor, or that this deep into this, that this many nations would still be supporting Ukraine. But it's not going to last forever unless the president stands up and says, this is why we're doing it. This is why it's worth it. And we're going to make sure that Ukraine wins, because China's watching. Our prosperity is tied to European prosperity, which depends on stability and security in Europe. So all of these are good cases. Every American has something in their house that came on a ship from some other country. That's freedom of navigation. I mean, that's what's at stake. Respect for international agreements. That's what's at stake here. Now, to the specifics of what you're talking about, you know, I generally prefer to talk about capabilities instead of specific platforms. The capability that Ukraine needs to win is the ability to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces, to pound the hell out of Sevastopol so that the Black Sea Fleet can't sit there, they can't do maintenance, they can't refuel, they can't rearm, make it impossible for the Black Sea Fleet to stay there in Sevastopol. And instead, they have to reposition to Novorossiysk, which I think is probably another 350, 400 kilometers to the east, which does not have the same amount of maintenance and other support activity. So not only would it be further away, it would be more difficult for them to maintain the capability of the Black Sea Fleet. Pound the heck out of the Russian air base at Saki and the logistics hub at Jankoy, so that the Air Force can't just keep flying, and they just can't keep launching drones, and they can't keep supporting ground operations from Jankoy. That's why they need this long-range precision strike capability. Now, the one advantage that the Russians have, of course, is almost always going to be mass. I mean, they don't care how many of their own guys get killed. They're up over 275,000 now, killed and lost, wounded, captured, you name it. So they'll always find more bodies to stick in there. But the way, I listened to General Cavoli a few months ago, the way you counter mass, you degrade mass, is with precision, as long as you have enough time. And that means precision strike against headquarters, precision strike against artillery, precision strike against logistics. If you take those three out, it doesn't matter how many tens of thousands of poor, unlucky privates you have sitting in the trenches out there, they are not going to be effective, especially as the weather conditions get worse here in the coming months. So if we were serious about Ukraine winning, then there'd be none of this question about, we don't have enough ATACMS. I've heard so many excuses why we haven't done it yet, whether it's ATACMS, ground small diameter bombs, Gray Eagle drones. There's so many different systems that could provide that capability. So Abrams tanks, the magic number was 31. That's what was agreed. That's exactly how many are in a Ukrainian tank battalion. That's where the number comes from, how they organize. The Ukrainians are not going to advertise, where those things are or what their condition is. They're very good about protecting information. Or they may decide to advertise exactly where they are to draw attention away from something else. Whatever they do, it will be a better decision than I would have come up with. The general staff is very, very good. They are running rings around the Russian general staff, and they have all the initiative. And I think those Abrams tanks won't change the outcome of the war. But if I'm a Russian soldier sitting in a trench with my little RPG, and it's starting to get cold, and I know nobody behind me gives a damn about me, and then I start seeing the Abrams tanks, That's not a good day.
Well, I would assume it would not be a good day. We'll get back to some of those points, but Peter, this whole question of giving Ukraine all that it needs to win, part of what goes on in this whole discussion are narratives, and you know, Kurt said the American public is with Ukraine and supports Ukraine, but there really are two competing narratives about our American public, and polls that say different things. On the one hand, some say American public is strongly in support of Ukraine. Others, usually the opponents, say the public is getting tired of the war and continuing aid. I'd like to ask you, Peter, what's your read on how you see the struggle in Congress playing out and all these different views of where the American public is?
Before I get into that, I would just compliment some of the remarks already made. And note, when I left the National Archives, when I last saw you, Bob, Thursday evening after President Zelensky's remarks, I was a bit flummoxed by the trip to Washington. The two deliverables that at that point had been announced, so potentially speeding up the delivery of the Abrams tanks on the one hand, and on the other hand, exempting some American officials from a government shutdown that were working on Ukraine, should it come to that point, didn't strike me as a sufficient presidential deliverable to justify a meeting in Washington. The president could have easily met with President Zelensky on the sidelines of the UN if that was the extent of it. Now, as Kurt pointed out, we know that the delivery of ATACMS with cluster bomblets is either in country, on its way, whatever the status of that is. I think generally means that trip was a success and worthwhile, and a positive for Ukraine. As for Congress, for one, I would be very, very wary of interpreting polls at face value. I've seen a lot of vacillation and polling based on how questions have been asked, the pattern and sequencing of those, and so I would just urge everyone when they're looking at polling data on Ukraine to go into the methodology and into the poll itself before they draw any top-line conclusions. Having said that, if we accept that, say, 40 to 45% of Republicans support assistance and aid to Ukraine, which is generally the medium for some of the polling questions of late on that topic, I would actually submit that that's a relatively healthy number, because the war in Ukraine is closely associated and identified with President Biden. And I can't think of any other issue where the opposition party, the Republicans and their voters, support at that level a priority and a policy vector so closely tied to the White House. Take tax policy or immigration policy. You'd be hard-pressed to find 10% of Republicans who would be pleased with President Biden's performance. And so I think 40 to 45% might actually spell a decent number, or mean that a decent number of Republicans are prepared to support Ukraine going forward. Anecdotally and based on the counts, Kurt also mentioned this in Congress, I think we have pretty strong bipartisan support, especially in the Senate, but also in the House. As for the CR, the negotiations that are ongoing right now, and I just spoke minutes ago before we got on this call with a pretty senior aide to a very senior senator, those talks are taking place as we meet right now between the four corners in the Capitol, between leadership, between the Congress and the White House. I don't think anyone quite knows where it's heading. If I had to venture a guess, if you put a gun to my head, Bob, I would say that the Senate will move first with a relatively clean bridging CR that will include some Ukraine funds. And then that will potentially avert a government shutdown. And then in a few weeks, we'll have the House and Senate take another shot at a continuing resolution if they don't manage to pass all 12 appropriations bills. And that continuing resolution would then, with Democratic votes in the House, include some of the larger chunks of money that the White House has asked for. So I wouldn't anticipate that in the next week you're going to have a fully funded Ukraine supplemental along the lines that the White House has asked for, but there will be monies in there to keep the support going. And then at some point in the future, once the congressional maneuverings play out, I think you'll see the money there. I would add, maybe as a final concluding note, though, that even if this supplemental is fully funded, which in the end I expect it will be, There's a lot of, I think, talk on Capitol Hill amongst legislators that they wouldn't like to take a vote on this anytime soon again. They prefer to kick it past the next election. I don't see how that's possible given the math and given the amount of money that the White House is asking for. So we'll probably be back at this task sometime in the spring, even if it does, pass in the next month. And that, of course, is one of the burdens and one of the weak points, if one can call it that the West has to deal with as it seeks to support the Ukrainians. And the Russians are, of course, watching as well and delaying any concessions on their part, so long as they think that the West might break. With that, back to you, Bob.
Well, thanks, Peter. I do comment that another member of our Friends of Ukraine network had lunch last week, and he's been speaking around the country to small groups. And I mean, tying into what we've been talking about, the American public, he's gone to audiences that he knew were generally against Ukraine, supporting to Ukraine. He's found that they're very uninformed, and they have very strong, they view things and think they have answers. And when challenged and told what you and I and the rest of the panel know are facts, he said there's a significant majority of those audiences were openly changing their minds. So that whole thing that we've talked about, that I think Ben first said in this conversation, about getting the word out by the leadership of the country, the president, saying how important this is to us and setting that tone is really very, very important. John, you are the Friends of Ukraine Network's go-to guy on almost every issue relating to Ukraine. And I've held you back here toward the end to be the cleanup hitter for the opening comments, to tie things together. And in doing so, I also want to mention that we have a question in the chat box about why are some Western officials pressing Ukraine on having elections next year despite the war? Could you include that in your sweep here of where we are?
Sure. I can be relatively brief because, in fact, so many good points were made by our panelists. Let me start, though, with the problem of framing our policy. Kurt and others mentioned, and you mentioned too, Bob, the need for a Reagan-esque Oval Office speech. And that's exactly right. What the administration has not done is explain to the American people in clear terms what vital American interests are at stake in this war, in Moscow's war on Ukraine. They have not pointed out the important fact that Putin is pursuing what experts call a revisionist foreign policy, meant to change the shape of the international order in Europe, globally, but especially in Europe. And to do that, he needs to undermine NATO. And so what the president should do is point out that Putin is seeking a policy objectives that are going to cost American money and American lives. If Putin wins his war in Ukraine, we have to worry about Russian aggression in the Baltic states, in Poland and Romania, all NATO allies. And immediately our defense expenditures will go up far more than what we're spending right now to assist Ukraine. And if Putin were to move on one of our NATO allies, we would be in a war with Russia, which would cost American lives and also greatly increase our expenditures. So the $40 or $50 billion of economic and military assistance that we give to Ukraine a year, which is worth approximately 3.5% of our defense budget, and which has enabled Ukraine to destroy up to 50% of Moscow's military capability, is very much in our interest. It's a smart and inexpensive way to defend vital American interests, American stability, American security, and American prosperity. If the president were to define it that way, that would make it impossible for for strategic nincompoops to ask, when does this forever war end? Because they would understand that this war is simply the way that we are keeping Putin penned up before he could do more damage to us. Then you could remind these strategic nincompoops that we pursued a policy of containment of the Soviet Union for 40 years, and the defense expenditures involved with that were far greater than involved in our support for Ukraine today, and we were able to manage it. This would also end conversation about, well, what is the game plan for the administration? The administration's game plan is to thwart an aggressive power who is coming for our bacon in a place where our bacon is not quite at stake, and why we therefore have a vital interest in Ukraine winning this war. And finally, coupled with that, the administration should say, therefore, we want Russia to lose, Ukraine to win, and we're not going to dribble out weapons to Ukraine so that they can prevent a Russian victory. We're going to send Ukraine everything it needs to expedite a Russian defeat in Ukraine. That's what we need. Now, Kurt pointed out that there have been American politicians who are saying this. The Republican leadership in the Senate, Mitch McConnell especially, deserves a great deal of credit. But, I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who noted that the president has the bully pulpit. No U.S. senator, no matter how smart or how wise or how loud, has the bully pulpit. So this has to come from the White House. And I would hope, but I say I would hope as a saying I know, that the administration understands that their legacy in foreign policy hinges on a Ukrainian victory, a Russian defeat in this war. I think if they understood that clearly, then the recommendations that we are making, explaining our interests, sending the weapons faster, would be our policy. Intuitively, they understand it. They understand a Russian victory would be a disaster, but they have not made that conscious, energetic policy, and that's a mistake. With that, let's talk for a moment about elections in Ukraine. A smart person whose name I will not share said to me that the reason why Lindsey Graham, who's been great, by the way, on the Russian danger, on the need to help Ukraine, talked about elections in Ukraine right now, because listening to the quasi-isolationists in his own party, spreading the nonsense that Ukraine is not a democracy, thought that having an election would help answer that criticism. And he's right, it would help answer that criticism. But it's also true that having an election during a war contradicts the Ukrainian constitution. Various international election organizations are urging Ukraine not to have an election. And in fact, the Ukrainian opposition, Zelensky's opponents, don't want that election. So I think that this proposal has a lot of, but is not the best way to deal with the problem. The best way to deal with the problem is to describe Ukraine's largely successful experiment in democracy. It has been a country that right after the Soviet Union disappeared, held a free and fair presidential election, has had several since then, and has taken serious steps towards democracy, towards a full-fledged democracy, despite the nasty influence of Moscow, whose nasty influence now includes an aggressive war crime-filled war on Ukraine. I think that's the way to handle this.
Excellent. I can't disagree with a single thing, not only what you said, but how you said it.
Bob, is it possible to jump in and just comment on a few
Absolutely.
here?
Absolutely.
Great, because I wanted to just underscore what every panelist has said thus far, and that is the importance of the communications and the narrative. We, all of us, as panelists and separate from this particular track, We all are engaged in issues relevant to supporting Ukraine, whether it's the military issue, it's economic sanctions, it's about rebuilding, and it's also about trying to garner support globally. So 2 points I'd make. I do want to underscore, especially from having worked in the Reagan administration, it was so important and so crucial to be speaking to the American public. Time and again, in explaining issues, foreign policy issues, why resources would be used, why we did what we did. And I would submit, I don't think it's only just a matter of a speech or two. I think it has to be an ongoing narrative to garner the support for the longer term in terms of the American public, because it's not only about the war, but just recently, a number of institutions have held conferences on rebuilding of Ukraine. By the way, that involves our private sector and the private sector of other countries. And so support here is needed, not just for the short term, the long term. So this aspect in a strategic framework, the moral narrative and communications and public diplomacy has to be part of it. And just the second comment I just want to make is just flipping back to the United Nations General Assembly. You asked me about Zelensky. I will say that President Biden's speech there, it was strong in terms of indicating support about the impact all of the countries in the room would be affected by it. But that platform is not the platform that the American public is listening to. So I do want to say that because it was interesting. He used that platform, and it was striking with China, France, UK, and not in Russia, none of them being present at the head of state level. So in that context, actually, I think he got a lot of attention, but it's not the same in terms of speaking to the American public. So as part of a war strategy, it's not the only military and economic and the political component, but there is this important public diplomacy component. I wanted to underscore it because it's not something that I think all of us in our different capacities focus on as much as we should, or pound the pavement as much as we should on it.
Bob, there's a comment in the section question from Nina Sakun. If you could read it.
So, which one are you talking about?
From Nina Sakun. She has a comment which I think is just what I said. And I'd like to, she has a point, I'd like to answer it.
Yes, go ahead, please.
All right. For those who have not seen it, it just says, it seems a little strange to me that you are criticizing Biden. And I agree, of course, too little and too late sending aid. But still, you seem to ignore that the Republicans are fighting against this aid. And they have convinced the majority of their voters how it is helpful to whitewash them like you seem to be doing. Okay. First, it is true I did not specifically mention the troublesome Republicans, and I'll do that in a minute. Although I did refer to strategic nincompoops. So I don't think I was giving anyone a free ride.
And we knew who you were talking about.
Yes, correct. But so let's be clear. The strategic nincompoops are first and foremost, not only, but primarily the quasi-isolationist wing of the Republican Party. And that is a small, but as Kurt said, a very, very loud group. And of course, their policy instincts are dreadful. If in fact they determined the policy, I think that that would be a disaster for American interests, and history would not be kind to them either. And I should add, this was implicit in what I said, but let me make it explicit. Biden's policy has been impressive in its energy and its breadth. The amount of aid we've given is enough. I quarrel with the quality of the military aid, but the amount of aid we've given is sufficient. The rallying of our allies and partners has been impressive. The sanctions effort has been good. The isolation of Putin has been good. All of that's true. And if that policy continues, I suspect Ukraine will win this war, just slower than it would if we did the right thing with weapons. But coming back to the Republicans, this is a problem with part of the party. It starts with the former president and the leading candidate to become the new nominee. It has been his influence, Trump's influence, has been felt among the Republican base, and that's where the polling numbers going down in terms of Republican support for Ukraine come from. All of that's true, and so they deserve substantial criticism for this. But it is true, if Biden spoke with the clarity that a number of us advocate, a lot of Republican voters who are right now on the wrong side of this would move in the right direction. And also, the administration is giving the isolationists their arguments. The fact he doesn't talk about Russian revisionism and our vital interest in stopping it enables Rand Paul to talk about the forever war. The fact that they raise nuclear threat is talking point number one for the nincompoop strategists. There is a 70-plus year history of American nuclear diplomacy. And until this administration, no one said we can't do X or Y or Z because Moscow might go nuclear. We have to think about those things. We don't talk about it. So that's why the administration is giving gifts to the isolationists, which are not in our interest. But again, the isolationists represent a far more dangerous policy option than the Biden administration's.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I couldn't have said any of that better. Ben, I would like to ask you something. You know, there's an awful lot of harping, and I know you've addressed it in some interviews and so forth, by sometimes, I don't know that they've been named, but unnamed sources saying that we've trained the Ukrainians on how to fight a war, and they're not doing it the way they should. They're not doing it like we told them to. Seems a little disingenuous to me, and I have my thoughts, but I'd like to have yours. Your mood.
Millions of people wish that I was muted. This is an unprofessional, unhelpful, and unnecessary statement by anyone that says, well, we trained them to do it. You know, we showed them how to do it. They're not doing it. That is, first of all, somebody that's 8,000 kilometers away critiquing how somebody is entering and clearing minefields and trenches should be ashamed of themselves. Secondly, we would never send an American soldier or a British soldier or a German soldier to do this without having already achieved total overwhelming air superiority. And the famous combined arms training that we supposedly showed the Ukrainians how to do assumes that you have air superiority and all the other things. So I think most people dismiss those criticisms early on for what they were, which was perhaps a little bit of CYA to explain, why things might not have been going as well as they should have. I would defer to the general staff, the Ukrainian general staff and local commanders 100 times out of 100 on this. They have shown, 2015 is when we first started doing the training with Ukrainians, and I'll never forget, I asked, I was standing next to one of my sergeants. This was an old sergeant first class, a paratrooper from our airborne brigade. This guy had probably been in Iraq and Afghanistan half a dozen times. I mean, he had been around all this. And so now we were training. This is our first iteration with Ukrainian soldiers at the Yavoriv training area. So I'm watching, I turned to this old sergeant. I said, hey, man, so what do you think? He said, sir, I tell you what, these dudes are not Iraqis. I mean, that was the highest praise he could possibly give, that how quickly the Ukrainians had learned. And we started learning things from them. We changed our training model in Germany. And then the Army, under General Milley, when he was chief of the Army, changed our training model based on what we were learning from Ukrainians. So I think that their ability to adapt, the fact that they're not doing it the way we drew it up, means only that they realized they had to change in order to be successful. And we're seeing that. I think, unfortunately, it seems to have died down a little bit, this nonsense that, the counteroffensive is going so slow and all that. do not think of the counteroffensive as just what we see on the ground. I mean, they are doing what NATO and what the U.S. calls multi-domain operations, meaning air, land, sea, special forces, cyber, information, all of that. They're doing it. You've got the ground assault. You've got drone strikes that are shutting down commercial air traffic all over Russia, as well as in combination with commando raids, knocking out radar, knocking out air defense, and destroying a very important Russian maintenance facility on Crimea. And then, of course, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet has a new sunroof. So the things that they are doing is so impressive, and it puts enormous pressure on the Russian general staff. I mean, you can imagine the phone calls they're getting every time a drone shuts down, the airports outside of Moscow. Like, why can't you stop these guys? And so you got air defense assets. They're already thin. They're being moved around. The Russian general staff is having to respond to what the Ukrainians are doing, which is exactly what you want, versus us worrying about what the Russians are going to do.
Thank you, Ben. You explain it in such great terms. It's wonderful, and I like the sunroof at the headquarters. Kurt, we've got a question in here about Poland's, it's worded as sudden threat to stop military aid due to the grain dispute. You want to discuss that a little bit?
Sure. It's a combination of things. It is a little disingenuous, frankly, to be honest, that the Poles are blaming the Ukrainians only for grain leaking into the EU and Polish market and depressing prices. I'm sure that there are businessmen in Poland that are making money off of this, as there are probably some businessmen from Ukraine making money off of this. And it's a shared interest of Poland and Ukraine to manage this. But with Polish elections coming up and the unhappiness in Poland about the depressed grain prices, the Polish government felt it needed to do something. So they made this announcement that, well, they're not providing any new weapons to Ukraine. They're not limiting the transshipments of everybody else's stuff. They put out a statement yesterday to moderate the tone quite a bit. Zelensky put out a statement this morning also moderating the tone. So I think this is a little bit, as the question indicated, a little bit of politicking right now in order for the government to appear that it's responsive. But it doesn't change Poland's fundamental strategic interest in Ukraine defeating Russia in the war and their overall support for Ukraine in this.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a question here, and I'm just not going to assign anybody, see who would like to take it. That it has to do with the ongoing expressions that you read, and I would say mostly by unnamed sources, about how we're depleting our arsenal and how that's of concern. Who'd like to take that? Peter, you follow these things, and so does Ben.
I'm interested to hear what Peter says, but yes, of course, we're using a lot of stuff, a lot of our ammunition. Of course we are. And the Chinese are, I'm sure they're ticking off, trying to assess what we have in our inventory. But we do not have a shortage of ammunition. We have a shortage of political will. I mean, defense industry they're not charities. They have thousands of employees. They have very complex supply chains, and they, unlike a car manufacturer or a place that makes chainsaws, they don't make a whole bunch of tanks or expensive ammunition and then hope somebody wants to buy it. They have to respond to orders. And so when the Pentagon gets serious about something, they put big money on it. And what do you know? They would start working 3 lines there at Scranton or wherever it is. They're making artillery ammunition now. We've already tripled artillery ammunition production in less than a year and a half. Some of them are easier than others, but it's about political will, and political will manifests itself typically with where you put people and where you put money. And we had hand-wringing going on for a year. Oh my God, we might deplete our patriots or whatever, but there was zero increase. Lockheed was never asked by the Department of Defense hey, can you increase the number of, can you make ATACMs again? Open the line up. We need them now. Zero.
I would just reinforce that point. I mean, I think as most observers of this war and of our foreign policy debate know, the current type of conflict that's being fought in Ukraine is fundamentally different than the other main contingency that most observers are worried about, namely a Chinese amphibious attack on Taiwan. And a lot of the systems that we are providing are systems that the U.S. would not use to come to the rescue of Taiwan were we to go to war in such a scenario. So, you know, a 155 millimeter shell is something very different than an LRASM or, you know, some of the other air power systems in a naval battle, submarines, et cetera, that would be used there. So I think there's a difference, and I would say that we basically see the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to intensify, accelerate, and build out our defense industrial base. It's an early warning, a sign for what could face us in the future, and if we took this moment and saw it as a period before conflict where we can build up and have actual runway, which we wouldn't have if China had moved on Taiwan first, this can actually rebound to our benefit. If I could just very quickly also perhaps address some of the other questions, Bob, in just 1 minute. You know, part of the reason I think the focus is so much on the Biden administration rather than congressional Republicans is because in our system, foreign policy is an Article II powers responsibility of the president. And as Ambassador Herbst noted, the slow, incremental, cautious, tepid strategic vector that the Biden administration has chosen, in the end, has fed into the isolationist narrative that some are using to argue against supporting Ukraine. In a way, it's amplified and strengthened that line of argumentation. And I don't think this is just a matter of the president going out and giving a speech, although I would applaud it. It's a very intentional choice to use it in as long as it takes and leave that rather undefined. If the president had to go under the Klieg lights in front of the cameras and outline American war aims, I think one would discover relatively quickly that the Biden administration is committed to ensuring that Russia loses, but not necessarily to ensuring that Ukraine wins. If so, they would have spelled that out publicly on multiple occasions, and they've declined to do so. To the Polish grain spat that is taking place between Warsaw and Kyiv, here too, if the administration had, for example, released MQ-9 Predator drones that could accompany ships in the Black Sea, perhaps the blockade could have been broken. So I think these are examples of where we have unnecessarily inflicted own goals along the way, and probably could have done better. But you know, maybe to end on an optimistic note, you know, we're an open liberal democracy, and so we have these public debates. We bear our weaknesses to the world, warts and all. And so at times support looks uneven, and then there's a burst of money that gets shipped off within the U.S. oftentimes to help support Ukraine. The Russian system at times looks more efficient. It looks top-down, authoritarian. Putin has carefully stage-managed the system. But when their politics burst out in the open, you have Yevgeny Prigozhin marching on Moscow and trenches being built on the outskirts of Moscow. So I think our system has much more resilience and much more strength as a result. And I'm not sure that I would bet on the Russians when it comes to who has the longer breadth of this battle and who can actually who can outlast whom, because the Russians look formidable, but that system has some brittleness to it, and when it snaps, it can be rather dramatic.
Bob,
Very,
one of the questions that I see that's come in, because there are a number, I'd like to say a word about, and that's from Roman. His name is, I think, Omachinsky, and he raises the question of the Budapest Memorandum. And I especially wanted to address it because I was very struck by the fact when I was in New York and during the UNGA, I had the chance to meet with a number of Ukrainians. And we were talking about the aftermath of Vilnius and then marching forward to the US holding the NATO summit in 2024. And a number, no surprise, of Ukrainian officials were citing the crucial importance of Ukraine becoming part of NATO, and that this process, the accession process, needs to move along quickly and definitively. And as part of it, I thought it was very striking that actually the official also said, we're very concerned about security guarantees. We can no longer trust just a statement of security guarantees. Remember the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum gave us security guarantees, and that did not get us anything. So I'd like to just underscore what Roman says. I think Roman is right to feature it. I think there will be skepticism going forward, and I think that's something that the United States, the West at large, has to be thinking about. And I want to give Ben the last word before he has to pop off. So, Ben, saw your note.
Yeah, Ben has to jump off at 1 o'clock. So your rapid fire answer.
Well, Paula, that is very generous for you. Thank you. The only thing I would add would be that, government shutdown is going to affect all of this. I mean, there are thousands of people involved in the processing of delivery of ATACMS or other things. I mean, that soldiers may still get paid in some places, but the whole process, this is going to grind potentially to a halt, depending on how long the shutdown is as well. I mean, obviously, it won't be business as usual. So hopefully, our Congress will do their constitutional duty and make sure that there's a budget and the government does not shut down.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you for making sure. You don't have any idea the schedule he told me about, that he has found this hour to join us at night from Germany. So thank you for being with us. There are a lot of questions in the box here, and one was directed toward Ben, but I believe that John, any number of people can respond to it, and so I want to get to it. This is intended primarily for Ben Hodges, but how stable or unstable is the internal situation in Belarus? And could the Ukrainians exploit this in expanding the front line with Russia? John, you're mute.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. We know that Belarus, like Russia, is an authoritarian regime which seems to be stable, but then suddenly it's not. In the case of Belarus, we saw that in the falsified elections in 2020, leading to 6 months of mass demonstrations, which even now still occasionally recur. In the case of Russia, we saw with the Prigozhin mutiny. We know that the Belarusian people do not want to be attached to this war. We know that there has been significant sabotage of Russian supplies heading through Belarus to Russian troops in Belarus and perhaps beyond into Ukraine, at least before the Russian retreat from around Chernihiv in the spring of 2021. So there's no question that there is instability in Belarus, which perhaps can be exploited. But again, we don't have great insight into the how close instability is in either Belarus or Russia. But it's clear that the Ukrainian General Command pays attention to domestic affairs in both Russia and Belarus. And I suspect they may have some sense as to what is possible. But I can't be more specific than that.
You don't have anything on that, or do you? No. We have a number of questions, and I know John is going to need to bow off here pretty quick as well, and Kurt. But do we think enough is being done on the economic front to defeat Russia? Should there be more things accelerating defeat, sanctions, export controls? Kurt, your thoughts on that one?
Well, the answer is no. Enough is not being done. We do have a very robust set of sanctions in place, but sanctions require maintenance and implementation and adjustment over time. And just one statistic that someone shared with me from the EU about 2 weeks ago is that the decrease in European Union trade with Russia has been 100% offset by an increase in European Union trade with Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So I'm sure the goods are not going to those countries. This is people who are sanctions busting to continue doing a trade with Russia. So it needs a lot of maintenance on that. There are a couple of other things I would just like to throw into the mix. One of them is we haven't been aggressive enough on the financial transfers and the financial sanctions. We've sanctioned some big Russian banks, but not all Russian banks, so the big ones can use small ones. It has had an impact on average Russians, but it hasn't had a major impact on Russia's economy as a whole. And so there's more that should be done on the financial side. There is also more that could be done on the energy side if we were willing to endure some higher energy prices. That's a judgment call that I understand the administration doesn't want to make, but it could do actually more to damage Russia. Energy is the main source of revenue for the government that keeps them funding the war.
Bob, if I could also jump in on that question.
Sure.
Kurt just took the last point, or I was going to make, on energy. I think that energy is one of the key areas which actually much more can be done. And by the way, the Russians, even though they're big energy producers, they also have requirements on servicing their equipment, and which they do rely on the West heavily. That's a sector and an area much more could be done. But let me also use this space to underscore, because I don't think any of us have referenced in this session, the importance of Russian assets. And I know that all of us believe very strongly about the seizure of Russian assets and using these assets for war reparations. There's still some debate going on about this, but it has to be underscored. This is a crucial, critical area that really matters. And it's one that the US government, and not just the US government, but those in policy should be really advocating very strongly and getting also other countries to join in.
On that, Paula, I will note that one of the Friends in Ukraine Network's task forces is the Reimagining, Reconstruction, and Recovering Task Force, headed by Anders Oslund. Not too long ago, they had a webinar about the assets, and there's some experts there that more people need to listen to. They set out exactly how those can take. They went right over the objections and the concerns. It's a very powerful task force. I refer you to our website, and you can listen to it. They're going to be doing another one upcoming fairly soon. I don't want to go on without addressing, this is a long question, but it's been here from early on. The question is on media and the timing of some stories in the media. Just over a week ago, the New York Times published an article raising suspicions that a massacre of civilians might have been caused by an errant Ukrainian missile and was not another Russian strike against non-combatants. The story broke just before Zelensky was to ask for ATACMS. Such a story, of course, undermines Ukrainian reputation as exceptional practitioners of precision warfare, perhaps raising doubts. Moreover, also last week, several foreign-owned media outlets in Poland reported to Western media partners that Poland would no longer deliver weapons. I want to just address the fact that some of these stories that come out, and John, I know you're going to need to leave. Why don't you start first on the news media?
Okay. We know that all governments, including our government, will leak things to the press for political advantage. And I can understand the suspicion of the questioner regarding the Konstivka missile strike. Having said that, I don't know if that's what explains this article. I had seen reports first in the Russian media within hours of that strike, saying it was it was Ukrainians who did it. Sometimes mistakes are made, but I'm just not certain if that's how you can explain this article, but it's plausible. As for the stories in the Polish media, well, there was a rough patch very recently in Polish-Ukrainian relations relating to the sale of Ukrainian grain in Poland. Kurt described the situation, I think, thoroughly. But it's conceivable that as part of pushing back by the Polish government, you had leaks that explain those stories. But again, that thing seems to be largely behind us.
I'd also just note that while there are lots of ways, as Ben has already talked about, lots of ways to conduct a war, there's a lot of elements. And while the Russian army and military may be not doing so well, the Kremlin is far, far ahead of us in the propaganda wars and the placing of articles, the undermining of things and so forth. We haven't matched them at that level at all. Kurt, I know you're going to need to go. I mean, we're over our time, and we got people going. I know that Peter can stay a little bit, and Paula can, but I know Kurt, you have to peel off. Why don't I give you a few minutes to say what you want to say?
Well, I'll take that question about the media and spin it in a slightly different direction. I don't know what motivates someone in the New York Times or elsewhere to put out the things that they do, and we see things come out of the Rand Corporation sometimes, and Council on Foreign Relations. So what I think we need to understand is that there, as Paul said, there is a competing narrative. There's a very strong competing narrative that many people subscribe to. This is very dangerous for the United States. It risks getting us directly into a war. Ukraine can't win. Russia can't be defeated. We shouldn't be doing this. It's a really very strong argument that people make. And we really have to be making the case at the highest levels and as often as possible to keep the focus on where I believe it should be, which is the way we manage the risk of this conflict is by helping Ukraine win as quickly and decisively as possible. A Russia that continues to fight and that succeeds in defeating Ukraine or getting ground and holding it in Ukraine is going to continue to fight aggressively elsewhere too. So ultimately, if that affects any of our current NATO allies, that will drag the U.S. into a war. So we have a vital interest in getting Ukraine what it needs to win this as quickly as possible.
John, you have you're muted.
Just going to say I've got to take off, but thank you for inviting me to participate.
Well, and thank you for all that you do constantly, day in and day out, and for you too, Kurt. With our remaining couple of panelists, we have. I mean, there's just so much that we haven't been able to cover. We would like to cover, and so forth. Why don't we simply? I'm not sure I've got everybody. Do I have everybody? Paula, would you like to have some closing comments?
Sure. I scanned down a number of the questions, and some of them are not questions, but they're also comments. And let me make three concluding points. First, I do want to just pick out Victor Rudd because I do read a number of his pieces on Ukraine. He added to the discussion on the Budapest Memorandum that it's also about the destruction of Ukraine's conventional weaponry at the time and the manpads. And I just would like to first make the point about NATO and NATO enlargement. We have an important opportunity in 2024. The US is hosting this summit, and this is where it's going to be crucial in terms of the position we take relative to Ukraine's accession, concrete accession into NATO. And I think it's very clear, as Ukrainian officials themselves have said, it's not just about the rendering of security guarantees. They remember Budapest Memorandum quite well. It is, when you're part of NATO, you're part of a process that there's a hard and fast security framework. Ukraine will also have to do its part, let me underscore that, in terms of its entry into NATO. The second one, Bob, that I'd mentioned that we haven't hit upon, we have focused a lot on the European arena, And I'd like to mention, from having been recently in Taiwan and Japan, the importance of the Indo-Pacific. It's striking the fact that Japan has upped its defenses. It has, not just only because of China's aggression in the South China Seas and the concern about China's investments in rising its own military, but also it is concerned about what is happening across the globe in Ukraine. Prime Minister Kishida came to Washington and delivered a speech in which he actually spoke to this very issue about how what happens in Ukraine will affect us. So I want to make that point because I think that's an important one to remember here. And that just circles me back to your first question to me about UNGA and the message by Zelensky. I think when we speak about moral narratives and narratives, I will say that here the Ukrainians have certainly been on the offensive against Russian disinformation, which you pointed out, Bob, that there's a war going on in terms of information. But what I like especially is the fact that the Ukrainian, not only the office of the presidency, the president himself, but his diplomats are reaching out to all members of the community and trying to engage them and point out how this invasion of Ukraine affects everyone. And I think that was underscored up at the UN. And I do think it's having an impact. So I will end on that note. And thank you for bringing us together, Bob.
Peter?
I'll make three concluding points as well. The first pertaining to NATO. I don't think there is an alternative to NATO for Ukraine. As Paula mentioned, the assurances made in the Budapest Memorandum were insufficient. And so when today Ukrainians hear about loose assurances, they obviously think back to 1994. I also don't think that unilateral American security guarantees are viable because we've been having a debate with Europe for over a decade now, if not longer, about the importance of burden sharing. And for the U.S. to alone take on the burden of guaranteeing Ukraine's security while nearer European powers within NATO are unwilling to husband that same responsibility, I think would be a tough sell in the United States Senate, which would have to ratify anything that approaches serious security guarantees. So NATO, I think, is the answer. I'd also argue to those who talk about an Israel-style relationship with the United States, where there's just periodic weapons deliveries to give Ukraine a certain military quality outside of a formal guarantee. Israel has nuclear weapons. Do we want the Ukrainians to go for nuclear weapons? If I were sitting in Kyiv and we're unable to get hard and firm guarantees from the United States and its Western allies, surely that's something that would come up in debate. On sanctions, I agree with Kurt's point on the problem of import evasion, one-way trade between, say, Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan to Russia has skyrocketed, and that is been able to bypass some of the import restrictions that we have put on Russia. But as one Ukrainian put it to me in November when I visited Ukraine, it's hard to remove and extract Siberia from Russia. They have massive natural resource wealth, and that is just a reality of life. So I think there needs to be, now that the administration's strategy of trying to forge and manage their way towards some sort of military equilibrium that leads to a political negotiated off-ramp has come up craps, because the counteroffensive does not seem to be in the next month pushing all the way to the Sea of Azov. Now that they're back to the drawing board, I think there have to be serious discussions about whether or not we need to adjust the price cap. That would, I think, mean all sorts of diplomatic sort of ruffles, feathers being ruffled, but it's a conversation I think we need to begin to have with our allies. And on the media front, final point, I will say the only reason, if that is a Ukrainian air defense missile that crashed in the marketplace, had to be fired in the first place is because the Russians are firing missiles at Ukrainian cities, because the Russians are invading Ukraine and going after Russian civilians. So I think that's an organizing point, a background point that has to be made. And I actually am cautiously optimistic that Russian media operations, while formidable, are so top down and centrally controlled that they sometimes struggle up against the more organic media landscape that the Ukrainians have been able to stand up. I mean, here we have a country full of smartphones taking videos of vignettes here and there in operations that are taking place and beaming those around the world. And it's hard for publics in the West not to trust their lying eyes, so to speak. I mean, when the Russians put out a narrative, but then in the next breath, you see videos of civilian infrastructure being rocketed, I think that does tend to have an effect on the public and shows that the Russians really can't be believed. If the war in Iraq was the war of sort of the satellite dish, and then the Arab Spring was sort of the era of Facebook and social media, this seems to be the war of smartphones. And I think at least early in the war, and perhaps the Russians have recovered a little bit, but early in the war, I do think on the media front, and Zelensky himself personally has been masterful at this, Ukrainians put up a pretty good fight. With that, I'll kick it back to you, Bob.
Okay, thanks both of you. A couple of things this subject didn't come up, or at least I don't think it did. I don't think I missed it. One of the arguments is that we're given all the money and the Europeans aren't, doing their part. One, that's wrong. And two, very recently, statistics have come out that the Europeans have now surpassed us, not only, and that doesn't include what is often left out, the cost they have for taking on refugees, which is immense. And the people in the United States and members of Congress who keep throwing that out, they just aren't sticking with the facts. And I think it's important that those facts be out there. Very, very important to have that. The one other thing, it was referenced at some point in our conversation, and I just want to reiterate it to our audience. I'll give one example. General Breedlove and I were in Phoenix talking for various groups, and he was talking the war and the things that you would expect him to do. And when I would talk about the kidnapping, the Russian official program of kidnapping Ukrainian children, putting them through, having their names changed, the birth certificates changed, brainwashing sessions so that they, as the Russians say, they come loving Ukraine. Within X number of time, they are now Russian citizens. Under the Geneva Convention, that is genocide. And when you describe it and you describe what some of the people, the children that have been able to be returned, talk about what it has been like, the audiences, American audiences, that's where I've seen the visceral reaction. Why don't we know this? America can't stand for this. That's a message. I mean, I know it's made the news, but I don't think that the significance, the outrageousness of what they're doing has really been penetrated the general public. And that needs to be part of what we get our citizens to know about. Peter, it looked like you wanted to say something about that.
No, but I would agree with that. I'd also just add, if that is on the very personal humanitarian level, an effective argument, perhaps on the broad geostrategic level, and it came up in the chat box, so I'd just make one sentence about this. There is an axis forming of revisionist powers who want to do the United States and the West harm. And the war in Ukraine is really the pivot point on which that axis is turning. The Iranians, who, by the way, the Biden administration has not gone after aggressively, and who would like to get back into a JCPOA-style agreement with, has been funneling drones and other weapon systems to the Russians at serious levels. The DPRK, the North Koreans, who are no friends of the United States, are supplying the Russians with artillery, and perhaps there are other things like cyber capabilities where the Russians have come up short against the Ukrainians, where the North Koreans could jump in. And of course, the Chinese are playing an important economic backstop role for the Russians, even if they haven't surpassed certain red lines on military equipment and materiel that the Biden administration has set out. So there seem to be, I hate to cast the war in terms of good and evil or right and wrong, because I think that does not resonate as much as the realpolitik arguments for a relatively war-weary and debt-ridden American public. But I will note that is not a cast of characters you really want to be a part of. And I think it speaks volumes about the righteousness of Putin's cause, which is to say it is not righteous at all.
Thank you. I think, unless anybody wants to say anything else, I think we've gone over. We've lost our friends who have gone off. I will say they've
Paula
all
and I are
gone.
with you to the end, Bob. Just keep us. Just remember that.
But I want to note that I know why all three left, and they all were going on to other Ukraine-related matters. So it's 24/7 Ukraine. And let me end by simply saying we are with Ukraine as long as it lasts for Ukraine to win on its terms. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.